Hello everyone from wherever you are joining us around the world. I'm Dominic Bond. I'm the Head of Practice for Philanthropy and Foundations here at Oxford HR, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's conversation on new frontiers in funding. This is the first panel session in Oxford HR's first ever Knowledge Festival, so we really are breaking new ground today. And this initiative is intended to stimulate meaningful and important discussions within the for-purpose sector, tapping into the vast array of experience and expertise within our network. We hope that we can make this either a 6-monthly or even a quarterly event, so we really do hope you enjoy this conversation today. And I'm being supported behind the scenes by Ruth, our digital communications executive. She's been the driving force behind the Knowledge Festival initiative, and she'll be managing things for us in terms of the chat function and the questions box. We've set aside 90 minutes for today's session, so we will definitely close by 2 o'clock UK time. And we're very keen to invite questions from the audience. So we'll leave a good amount of time at the end of the conversation for this. You'll notice that there's a question and answer panel in Zoom where you can post your questions. And what I will do is invite you to unmute yourself and ask your question if you'd like to do so. Otherwise, I'll put it to the panel on your behalf. I'm absolutely thrilled at the spectacular panel who are joining me for today's discussion, and I will introduce each one briefly in turn before we get started. Our topic today, New Frontiers in Funding, plays brilliantly to the panel's collective experience and their current roles. And over the course of this discussion, we hope that we can explore some practical ways to foster greater trust in funding relationships. We'll consider some of the most innovative new funding models and how they might intersect. And we will also look at power dynamics within the sector, particularly in relation to greater localization of funding. So let me go ahead now and introduce our panel, beginning with Her Excellency Dr. Amel Karboul, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Education Outcomes Fund, a bold initiative to raise $1 billion of innovative finance to support governments around the world to improve the education and skills of 10 million children and young people. Amel was Tunisia's first female Minister of Tourism and co-led the country's transition after the Arab Spring, leading to Tunisia's Nobel Peace Prize in 2015. She received the Presidential Citizens Medal as recognition for her exemplary deeds and services to her country. And in addition to these roles, Amel has held leadership positions with numerous organizations, including the Maghreb Economic Forum. Welcome, Amel.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Moki Makura, the Executive Director of Africa No Filter, a donor collaborative focused on shifting the African narrative. Moki is passionate about presenting a positive image of Africa and showcasing its heroes and achievements. And she created the Africa Our Africa website to serve as a repository of positive facts about the continent. Previously, Moki was Deputy Director for Communications Africa at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she was responsible for building and managing the foundation's reputation on the continent. Moki also serves on 4 nonprofit boards and is a member of an all-female angel investment group focused on women-owned tech entrepreneurs. Moki, welcome.
You, Dominic.
Katrin McMillan is founder and CEO of Hello World, an NGO which works with marginalized communities in Nepal and Uganda to provide access to online learning and bridge the digital divide through a network of solar-powered, internet-enabled education hubs. Katrin is a strong advocate for community-led development and good philanthropy. Prior to founding Hello World, Katrin had a distinguished career as a human rights expert and has worked as a producer-director in political theatre. In addition to Hello World, Katrin also founded the Buwari Soap Company and Projects for All. Welcome, Katrin.
So nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And John Rendel is Director of Grants at the Peter Cundill Foundation, a radical grant-making foundation that supports charities improving the lives of children around the world through trust-based philanthropy. Before moving into the philanthropy sector, John founded and led PEAS, Africa's largest and multiple award-winning network of non-state secondary schools. PEAS now employs over 1,000 staff and educates over 1% of secondary school students in Uganda. John began his career teaching mathematics in South London with Teach First. John, welcome.
Hi, Dom. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. So the idea for this panel topic was stimulated by a piece John wrote for our newsletter late last year on the benefits of unrestricted funding. One aspect which came through really strongly in that piece and the subsequent discussion it stimulated online is the vital importance of trust in relationships between funders and grantees, particularly in encouraging funders to provide less restrictive funding. So John, can I therefore come to you first for your thoughts on some of the practical things that both funders and grantees can do to foster greater trust between them?
Thanks, Dom, and hi everyone. Yeah, I think one of the reasons I took the job that I currently do is because there was such a range of grant making practice out there, and many years of being on the other side of things just showed me the potential of how the sector could improve. And I wanted to start by building a grant making function which was consistent with what I regarded as the best practice. And the ways that we have done that relate to trust, the big things are building fewer, deeper partnerships that are longer term and are unrestricted. So it's those four different things: fewer partnerships because this stuff's relational, and the greater extent to which you can build a deep relationship with the people you're working with, that obviously helps build trust. And unrestricted is absolutely critical because things change over time, and the more you restrict a partnership, the greater the extent to which what the organization that you're funding wants to do might be out of sync with what they've agreed to do through the funding, the grant agreement. I think we're in a position now to say to partners, if things go wrong, just let us know as early as possible. We don't really want any surprises. Let us know. And then we are then responsible for being responsible funders and not freaking out when something goes a little bit wrong, taking the rough with the smooth and working in a true partnership with the organization. So those are a few of the initial things. I think the grantees need to focus on being brave, and particularly being brave when they hear something from a funder that they realize probably isn't going to work very well for them. Early on in the conversation, actually talking through what the funder really needs and trying to find a fit between them and the funder that allows them to get what they need. Explain why that might not work for them. I think quite often each individual grantee wants unrestricted funding or wants the most sort of flexible finance, but they don't make the case to funders because on each individual grant they don't want to face that marginal risk of seeming like they're ungrateful. And I think it's sort of beholden on every single grantee to constantly make the case and discuss with the funder what they need. And the funders can, what we've done is we've shared with our partners a list of things, what we expect from you and what you can expect from us. And as far as possible, we've tried to have a real parity between the two so that we're encouraging our partners to hold us to account as much as the other way around. Anyway, there's lots more, but those are a few of the things we're up to.
John, thank you. That's really insightful and sounds like a fantastic resource. I don't know if it's one that could be shared, but just to give people a sense of how those relationships work on a real trusting basis.
Yeah, no, we're happy to share that one, definitely.
Brilliant. Moki, can I come to you next? As I've understood it, at Africa No Filter, you sit between a consortium of funders and the eventual grantees and beneficiaries. From your seat, what do you see as the vital ingredients for building that kind of trust?
Gosh, I was about to be the first person to be told you're on mute. Thank goodness. I got that myself. So yeah, no, Dominic, thanks for that. And just, I just want to just touch on a couple of things that John said, which was really about fewer and deeper relationships that, funders should kind of consider. And I think one of the bigger issues that I found over time, and the reason why I think a donor collaborative, which is what African Filter is a good way of doing things, is that we are in it for the long term. Because I've been in situations where funders will only fund for a year, for 2 years, and the grantee is never going to tell them what's going wrong, because they want everything to be going right, so they get more funding. So that when you start off on that sort of short term, and we're not quite sure where we're going to go with this funding, it immediately puts the grantee on a back foot, because they want to impress and they want to behave in a particular way. So that kind of trust and being open, tell us what's going wrong, almost never happens. But I think for African Filter, because of the way we've been structured, I actually see us as a bit of we're always like a secretariat for a bunch of funders who have come together to kind of take risk on something, and they've all been able to put in a little bit of money, which it's that kind of sort of funding that if it goes horribly wrong, you don't really have to answer the CEO because it was quite small. But when you multiply that by 8 funders, which is what I have, it becomes a fairly substantial amount of money. But trust that the entity you created, which in this case it was created, the team that are running it, the executive director, is somebody who understands what the vision is, because that's critical. Because you are actually, you are creating the vision, or you're bringing a vision to life for the funders. Somehow have been sold somewhere along the line. There is something that they've all signed up to. And the other thing that I think is important is that the trust is not, it can't necessarily be earned, which is what, it's a thing that we always say, trust needs to be earned. But in this stage, it's actually got to be given first, because if you're waiting for it to be earned, you will only ever work with the same old grantees that you've always worked with, and it'll be the same old. So you almost have to see that trust first. And I guess another, a lot of grant funders say it about, it's a learning grant. We just want to learn. They don't really mean it. But with a donor collaborative, the way you're set up to a certain extent, at least the way mine was, it was from its inception a learning collaborative. The whole point behind that, whatever we did was designed to help the funders learn. So it was money they were prepared to take risk with, and just understanding that from my perspective as running a donor collaborative that's about learning, I'm like, we need to take risk. We need to be doing stuff. We cannot do the same old, because we want to be safe, because the funders already know that. They've got, other grantees that are doing that. We are designed to be different. And that gives you a certain amount of empowerment, not even a huge amount of empowerment. And this thing about just being comfortable with failure, because we are not, as a society, comfortable with failure. I have worked in organizations where they said, we want failure, but the system is set up not to reward failure. You would never actually admit to failure. And I worked for an organization like that. Everything went well because it just wasn't the environment to say that it didn't. And the last thing I will say is that it's about diversity. I think one of the things that I've seen over time is that people want to work with people that look and sound like them, right? Because when the reports come back, they're written in the right type of English we understand. I mean, I've been in situations where people haven't wanted to work with Francophone organizations because the English isn't great. So when the proposals come in, they're not quite right. And when reports come in, they're not quite right. So that diversity, I'm suggesting people embrace that diversity rather than fear it, because I think that's a lot of it's a lot to do with how things are. Well, not quite too sure about that. Doesn't quite sound right. The proposal isn't written the right way, in the way that I expect it. And I think that's, and it all leads back to having a strong relationship. But over time, that comes naturally. But what we're saying with grantees right now, you've almost got to give that sense of trust. But let me stop there.
Moki, thank you so much. There's I love the give trust and take risk message there. I think that's really important. And on the diversity point, we definitely will be coming back to that later in the conversation when we talk about some of the power dynamics as well. Amel, can I invite you to share some perspectives from your experience, both as a funder and, if you like, also as a non-profit leader. I know you've been on both sides of this table.
Yeah, no, thank you. And actually, I'll start like John started, like why I took this job, you know, in a way, because, you know, I've spent most of my career, still most 17 years in the private sector and as an entrepreneur, you know, kind of the last 7 years of that. And then had the experience in government. And as you can imagine, like 2015, when we finished and Tunisia got the Nobel Prize, I was like, I'm, you know, kind of, I had this kind of urge personally to move from success to significance. And I took the role of leading, you know, a nonprofit in Tunisia. But I was a bit arrogant, to be honest. Like I was walking on water and thinking, you know, I've managed to succeed as an entrepreneur. We've been through this crazy, rewarding government experience. Watch my dust. I'm going to make the best NGO in the world. And I took it. It existed already for a few years. And kind of the board asked me, can you kind of put more speed and scale into it? And so I went in believing that. And then for 2 years, when I was leading it full time, I felt failing every day. Everything I've learned in my career on how to make organizations successful, I couldn't do. You know, I just like, I went in and I was like, you know, to scale this, we need a good HR system, we need a financial system, you know, like, how can I hire the best people, etc. You know, like, so, and then I would get, you know, grants that have either 0 or like up to 7% overhead, the maximum. Everyone wants all the money to go to the beneficiaries, which doesn't make sense to me at all. It's like if you've asked where I worked, Mercedes-Benz, to build cars without investing in R&D, you know, I mean, it's like, you know, it's insane, you know, and kind of, you know, I worked in top organizations in the world, and I felt like, you know, to be top and to be amazing and excellent at what you do, you have to invest in R&D, you have to invest in people, you have to invest in systems, and that all was not possible. So I felt almost a conspiration against me and the organization to keep us poor and unprofessional. And so kind of I stopped taking it personally and started talking with other, you know, kind of nonprofit leaders all over the world, and found it's not just me, you know, it's kind of a general trend. And especially if you come from the global South. So our organization was on the few in Tunisia that are really kind of global South and led by global South. And we didn't have any team in London or Berlin or Washington. And so I saw also sometimes us writing proposals and the money going to kind of, yeah, to the Save the Children and UNICEF and etc. of the world. And I was like, yeah, you're telling us we should build a kind of a civil society, we should build a third sector in this country, but we're never getting the money. And then the ambassadors would tell you, yeah, because you don't have the track record and you don't. So in a way, it was such a frustrating experience that I said, I want to work on changing the system, you know, because otherwise we are continuing to fund people in a way that undermines the impact we want to achieve. And so I kind of took, you know, kind of together with Gordon Brown and with Sir Ronald Cohen, Ronnie, you know, we sat together and we said, how can we create something in education, which is the Education Outcomes Fund, that allows us to support you know, nonprofits and social enterprise to support governments in solving the learning crisis, you know, because this is what we cared about. And because governments and big aid budget and big foundations can't give unrestricted funding, which I think is kind of what should happen. You should not hold people accountable for activities. You should hold them accountable for results. So I believe in really good M&Es, like really good verification of outcomes and impact, but give them the money as unrestricted. And the idea, because we couldn't do that because of parliaments and all these things. So we found this tool of results-based finance or impact bond, which actually allows that, you know, so kind of the government and the aid and, you know, kind of the institutional philanthropic money comes into a pooled fund and pays for outcomes once they're achieved. And kind of the people who pre-finance the work for the 3 or 4 or 5 years that it takes to achieve it, give the money to these social enterprises or nonprofits as unrestricted co-funding as investors. They don't care about the coffee cup. If you go and say, I need a new finance system to be able, or new data system, they'll tell you, yes, that's fine. And so that's what we're building right now. So it has various reasons why we're doing this, but because we're talking today about trust and unrestricted funding and the funding piece, this is what we want. So we want to increase effectiveness, because I've seen in government $70 million spent on textbooks that no one used as kind of ticked as successful because the money was spent and the textbooks were bought, but they were in the headmaster's cupboards in all the schools. So that's bad kind of spending of money. So we want to increase the effectiveness of grants, but increase it in a way that kind of achieves more outcomes in a meaningful way, that we develop those organizations that are delivering.
Thank you. And the emphasis there being on the impact and the results, and having that laser focus. Thank you, Amel. Katrin, as a founder, chief exec, I know this will be something that you think about a lot as well. Can you tell us a bit about your experience in building more trusting relationships, and have you seen these lead to less restrictive funding?
Yes, I mean, I really appreciate hearing what everyone has to say about this, and especially Amel, that crazy making dynamic of feeling that your hands are tied, and that basic rules of good business from the private sector bizarrely don't apply to our sector. In terms of trust, as I think everyone's touched on, is about relationships. So the question for us on the charitable side of the funding dynamic is, how do you build good relationships? Usually it works like this. Charities are in sales mode and funders are trying to catch charities out. And that's a really unpleasant way to work. It's unproductive, it's uncreative, and if you can upend that dynamic, then you're off to a good start. But it's really important to say that changing that dynamic is much easier for some people than it is for others. So in the global north, it's much easier to say I'm not going to engage with that particular power dynamic. But I do think that charities need to, as best they can, hold the line and be part of changing the relationship. So I think it's about getting to know people, telling the truth, finding out why the funder is in the relationship, being really honest about your own work, not overstating your impact. There's a lot of that goes on. Not running other charities down. I think it's really important not to do that. That's just a race to the bottom. And I would say ultimately, actually, like John said, in terms of funders having fewer partners, and that word partner is really important. We need to push for it to be a genuine partnership. I think that charities should look to have fewer partners with funders as well, and get to the point where you develop your confidence. And I'm only just learning. I'm still trying to learn this, where you say no more quickly to a possible funder, someone whose ideas are bad, whose opinions are toxic, who is going to fund in the wrong way. It's really important to be as quick as possible about saying, actually, I don't think this is a good fit. Thanks so much for your time. We're going to back out of this. And I also think it's important to really assess whether or not a heavily restricted fund is worth it. They're very tempting. But I really regret some of the restricted funds that we have taken, and there haven't been very many actually. Hello World has been primarily unrestricted in its funding. So I think I learned to be quite clear about when we won't take a fund if the restrictions are counterintuitive. So I think, you know, it is about building relationships, and I recognize that as charities, we also, if it's important the question is, who do you bring into that relationship in part? And at the moment, we have this sort of intermediary setup quite often where charities are working in the global south, raising money in London or New York or Germany or wherever, and that there's a sort of intermediary role between the funder and the people who are really the experts and doing the work in the communities and countries in which the funding is going to. So I think we all need to ask ourselves the question about who you bring to the table if you are in a position to host a meeting, and who you ask to be at the table as from the funding point of view, and who you are listening to. So trust is about relationships, and then all of the kind of normal rules of building healthy, happy, long-term relationships apply.
Thank you, Katrin. It's lovely to hear the different perspectives, but also the themes that are consistent throughout this. And something I'm hearing is, the need for bravery on the grantee side, to be stronger, to hold the line, to actually tell funders what is needed and have more of a voice. Easier things to say, I would argue, than actually to do when you're sat in that organizational leadership seat with all the responsibilities that go with it. Amel, were you going to add something, please?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think there is a difference between nonprofits in the North and in the South, because I think there is a layer of power dynamics that is not only relevant for nonprofits. I can tell you an example from my time as government minister. So when I came and I developed the strategy, how I wanted to change kind of the tourism sector, etc., and I was talking with some of the big donor countries, obviously, and like sometimes they would come in, I would say, okay, this is our strategy, and this is the money we want to give you and how to implement. And I was like, I'm not interested. Like, this is my strategy. And if you as a country want to support me, that's fantastic, because I need your support. But I want you to support my strategy, And I know that, kind of an off the record, after one minister of development has left, the ambassador came to me and he told him, I'm the first minister from Africa who said that to him, who challenged him. And so, and to say, like, either you help my strategy or don't help me, because otherwise I have very limited resources anyway of capable people who can, implement the work and do the reforms. And if you're gonna give me lots of $100 million to do something else, you're gonna divert even more from what we need to achieve, And so in a way, I feel that's kind of, that whole power dynamics plays it's scary that it plays in government so much, but it kind of plays then also in the nonprofit sector as a kind of an on top layer. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. I'm thinking I'm going to sort of shift the order of how we're talking about things away from what I planned, because this conversation of power dynamics, I think, is such rich ground. John, do come in.
I wanted to follow it in terms of bravery. I think you're right. It's easier said than done. And Moki's point about the length of grants is critical, because if a grant is just about to come to an end, you are always on tenterhooks. You every tiny little sort of marginal additional risk you don't really want to take. And one of the things we're doing practically in our foundation is we're doing 3-year grants, which is fairly normal, but we're extending them by a year every year, not at the end of the 3 years, but at the beginning of the 3 years. So once a year has passed, we extend the grant by another year. So you've always got a minimum of 2 or usually 3 years. And that simple change completely changes, obviously, the amount of time the grantee knows they're getting further funding. It changes the relationship because there is this longer sense of trust, this not immediate sense of risk. And it means they can plan and invest over a longer time horizon as well. It does mean a bit more risk for us, but not much more, because the old school way of doing it, 3 years followed by another 3-year grant at the end, at the beginning of the 3-year grant, you're still taking that amount of the 3 years worth of risk that something might go wrong. So we're just keeping it at that level of risk, basically. And of course, over time, you get more and more trust.
Mm.
I think that's such a great initiative. We talked about that a little bit last week, and having that guarantee that even if things start to go wrong, there's still a financial security for the grantee. Katrin, you were going to offer a perspective.
We at Hello World, we have made some grants ourselves, very small ones. We're a very small organisation, and actually, as such, I definitely run the smallest organisation of anyone in this conversation, and therefore I would say that all of my points should probably be taken with a big pinch of salt on fundraising, because it might reflect my ability or lack thereof to fundraise. But we have made some grants as well, and easily the most rewarding grant making process I've ever been through was with a friend and colleague in Nigeria, an extraordinary human rights activist who was working to combat female genital mutilation, breast lining, and other harmful practices. And we decided to give her 10 years completely unrestricted. And I asked and had to repeatedly ask her not to report on what she's spending that money on. She's in year 8. She's gone on to travel the world, to advocate for the issues that she works on. She's not, she was not from a privileged background in any way. She didn't previously have access to powerful people and money. And it was really important to me that she felt that she should just take that 10-year grant and spend it on herself. Because if she was able to keep herself and her family healthy, paid for, able to do the things they needed to do as a family, then she could apply her considerable talents to these issues that she knows so much about. And it's so rewarding, and it's without any labor intensity for us. The money just goes out every month, and that's it. That's literally it. And I highly recommend it.
Yeah, that sounds very inspiring and liberating, and it's based on trust as well. Has to be, whether that's already earned trust, or, as I think John said right at the beginning, just give trust, be trusting, and be brave as funders as well as grantees.
Can I just add on to that?
Oh, sorry, Moki.
Yeah, just, I think we this whole conversation about power dynamics, I think, being African, I think it's almost, if there's a hierarchy, Africa's at the bottom, African females even below the bottom. But I think Amel's point about being the first minister that had actually ever said no to a donor, I think is really interesting. And I think one of the issues that we find, or that I have seen in my time, is that when countries, charities, organizations, NGOs working don't have clear strategies of what they want to achieve, it's almost impossible to shift that power dynamic, because they're literally just scrabbling for whatever funding is there. So that strength of being able to say no is because you know what you've been set up to do, and there's clarity on that. And I know, looking around what happened during the COVID period, I know people were scrabbling for funds because NGOs still needed to exist, but all the money in the global north had shifted towards COVID funding. So there was panic, and people were just literally slapping the word COVID in front of whatever proposal they had, gender, blah, 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 COVID gender, and that, again, that you can call that clever, but again, it was just that sense of, okay, what is it we are doing? What are we trying to achieve? And what are we being measured on? And if I'm not clear about that, I am going to go to wherever the funding is. And that makes that power dynamic very, very unbalanced. So I think for us as African Filter, what's made us strong is that we have a clear strategy. So I'm able to say to potential funders who want to come on board and say, do this, do this. And I'm having a conversation with one of them now saying, well, actually, it's not within my mandate. I can't do that. So I'm not your typical grantee that you give the money and tell me to go off. You've got to join this, or you can, co-fund a piece of it, but this is what it is. And I think that sense of, I know what I'm doing, is critical for sort of organizations, global South, who want to get to that level of, equal power. I think that's critical.
But Moki, the thing is, I've said yes as NGO leaders to things that I didn't want to do, because the thing is, as a minister, okay, even if I wasn't greatly paid, I still was paid, and so in a way, when I was leading the charity, I knew that I really had mission creep, and I know it.
Yeah.
And I said yes, knowing it, because I would have had to fire people, so and so in a way, and I think that's another point that is important here, because I felt as being an NGO leader from the Global South, I was kind of, how you say it in English, the rock and a hard, whatever. I mean,
between a rock and a hard place.
Because there is very little philanthropy locally, and that's, we have to admit that as well, so in a way that it would be perfect world if you had, kind of Tunisian, African, Arab philanthropists who would support with grant making, core funding, and then you can say we leverage that by kind of applying for project funding from all over the world. But it doesn't exist. I mean, it exists very, very little. In every African country, you know, the 2 or 3 philanthropists, who they are. Everyone goes to them, you know. In our region, if I wanted to build a mosque, it would be much easier to collect money than, let's say, to do something which is about policy change or so, you know. So, and it's, but it's not just in a negative way. I think that's the lack of trust piece, you know. I mean, so another, I said, if I could clone myself, you know, the other job I would do is kind of to support creating the legal structure and the trust structure for philanthropy in our region more, you know, and you know, we do have still a bit of the complex of the white male. I know, like, I have a friend who wanted to kind of create a collective of Arab philanthropists, and to get them all in a room, she invited Bill Gates, you know, and when Bill Gates came, they all came, you know, in a way, you know, why do we need Bill Gates to have our billionaires meet, you know? I mean, it's just, you know, and then, you know, kind of develop philanthropy, which I think, Moki, you're doing, is really amazing. And I think if I wouldn't be doing this job, I would be doing that, which is kind of creating legal structure, kind of building more trust of local philanthropists with local organizations, better understanding political and other dynamics, why that's not happening, because that could also unlock. But at the moment, we don't have a thriving local philanthropy, which kind of puts even more pressure.
I
mean,
can,
I'll just say
turn
quickly
it to Moki, yes, because we talked about this a little bit.
Yeah, because I mean, and that's something. There's three of us, women who've come together trying to address some of the issues we're finding around African philanthropy, or the lack of it. But you know, one of the things that I feel is really important to just say is that, you know, African philanthropy right now, the handful, as you mentioned, of philanthropists that are giving into sort of big kind of systemic type, you know, philanthropy, as opposed to building schools and naming them after themselves, tend to work well with international foundations. When they do give, the money doesn't necessarily go directly, trickle down to local organizations. It goes internationally before it comes, because that lack of trust is also within African philanthropists. And I think there's probably a number of reasons for that. And I think part of it is the fact that because we haven't been able to build a robust NGO sector on the continent, because funding is so questionable, that things come and go, and when they're there, they do what they need to do, and it's just hard, you know. So I think there's systemic change we need to figure out on the continent before we strengthen the African philanthropy sector. But there's a group of us that working to try and see how we can support African philanthropy, because sometimes just presenting the problem to them is enough to make them shift the way they do things. Because I don't think anyone's ever said, but why, hold on, why, if you look at the money you're giving away, why is very little of it not going to outside organizations within the continent? Because a lot of time these foundations, philanthropists, they run programs. So the money they get is to fund programs which they are running for their foundations. So they're not even giving funds to any local foundations. So there's lots of problems around African philanthropy, and I think it's a really good conversation to have with the right people in the room, though, with the African philanthropists in the room, because I'd love to hear. And just one more thing I want to say, Amel, I was on a forum where one of the, you will definitely know this philanthropist, one of the top philanthropists in country said the reason why he got involved in the type of philanthropy he got involved with is because Bill Gates gave him a call and told him, look how terrible this particular sector is in your country. Apparently, he'd never, ever noticed it before until Bill came knocking. So that is the power of, you know, Bill Gates to shift, you know, African philanthropists from the very problem on their own back door, which they didn't see until Bill told them about it. But I was flabbergasted, but there you go. Back to you, Dominic.
John, I could see you were going to come in. Would you still?
Yeah, there's a sort of, just wanted to reflect on some of the points that have been made about the importance from the grantees perspective of building basically an unrestricted case for support. And this speaks to, I think, particularly what Moki was talking about, but also Katrin. If you don't have an unrestricted case for support, you can't expect people to have trust in giving you flexible finance. And so the way we evaluate partners, you're looking at the governance of the organization, the leadership, the bench, the extent to which there is a clear mission and that the activities are coherent in relation to the mission, the extent to which there's third-party proof of impact, and that the theory of change doesn't just assume lots of things which aren't actually true once they're tested. The extent to which they have strong financial reporting, internal and external audit, all these basic structural things. And obviously there's a vicious circle thing going on here. If you don't have unrestricted support, you can't build them. Amel was talking about that earlier on. And I think, you get that through core support, but the earlier you can invest in that, the better. And then one other reflection is, it's one thing for the CEO of a grantee to understand the importance of unrestricted, but they also need to make sure their fundraising teams recognize just how much better unrestricted funding is for the organization. You quite often get a big gap between CEOs fundraising for unrestricted and fundraising teams just getting into that easy habit, because they're more focused on the X number of dollars rather than the particular type of dollars, and that's the way they're often incentivized. And it's easier to conceive of a project, and that's their kind of MO, where actually they need to be focused on, is this organization creating for me a product as an organization as a whole, which I can go out there and sell? And if not, I need to support the organization towards that.
It sounds to me, John, like there is a need, and I speak from my own previous experience before doing this role in NGO leadership. There's a need for some support, whether it's labs for NGO leaders around thinking about this stuff and building organizations that are more unrestricted fundable. I completely take your point about there is a bit of chicken and egg to this. The things that you need to invest in, Amel, I hear you completely, are harder to invest in from your restricted income streams. The other thing that I'm hearing in relation to this is the question for grantees, a question of governance. And I think having been in a charity CEO seat and seeing the pressures of needing to cover the organization's costs and continue to grow the impact of the program, the temptation to follow some scope creep, to chase the funding is really hard to resist. And if you've got a board that's behind you and really supporting you to stand firm and stick true to the mission, and equally holding you very accountable to that, I think that's really important. I don't know how you see that, seeing as we've started to shift the conversation to talking about how organizations in Africa can raise more funding in this way. Is there an issue of governance there, or governance, is it a broader area for grantees? I'd be interested in some perspectives on that, if you feel that's relevant. Open to anybody who wants to hop in.
Look, to the point of being maybe a bit the bad news person here, or the pessimist person, but the question is, who are we talking about? I mean, I can't talk about the whole continent, obviously, because it's huge and kind of, I don't know every country, but I know a few countries. In some countries, you have like thousands of nonprofits and NGOs, but when you look deep behind it, is like, I think I've seen like a recent study, like for example, in Tunisia, I think the average annual revenue is like $500 or something like that. Like there are a massive amount of kind of NGOs that are one or two people doing this on the side of their job because they committed to something. If you're gonna talk about the few, which is a miracle, honestly, I don't know, I mean, like that manage from the global south to kind of do it, they're very few. And with those, you can start talking about, governance and boards and, kind of what plays a role. And I think some of them have chosen a different form of governance, which is those who are successful. Most of them either have teams in the global north, that kind of do the fundraising, but also kind of have, kind of board members and auditing and all this stuff. or they subcontract. So you have kind of either an international NGO or an intermediary that kind of raises the fund and subcontracts with them. And so kind of their own governance lead become less, because basically you have that kind of in between to kind of support them. So I'm just trying to do a reality check here, is that if you're talking about that type of sophisticated governance and boards holding you as a CEO accountable and helping you not to go into mission creep and with the right audit, we're talking about such a super thin layer. And for me, the question was more, how can I support not everyone, but at least kind of that layer, make it a bit bigger?
I think that there's I think there's a role to play for international NGOs, for recipients of funding like Hello World is in this, and I think that I at least feel that, speaking from on the point of view of Hello World, we had an obligation to build rigorous operational infrastructure in the countries in the global south that we work in, so that we can over time transition from running the organization from London and New York, in our case, to those two teams becoming increasingly obsolete and at this point a purely administrative. So we have these, and we've invested in superb teams and operational rigor in the global south. But I think that when we think about the funders' relationship with outcomes, we need to have a think about the balance between what it's achieved and how it's achieved, and both matter. And unfortunately, there is an overemphasis on what is achieved, and I think that is short-sighted. I think how we achieve the ultimate outcomes is most important of all, and ultimately will lead to longer-term sustainability and more effective what or outcome. And part of the how, in my view, is community-led, community consultation, local leadership and governance and oversight, local expertise, and part of it is building operational infrastructure and rigor in the countries in which we are all working. And we need to ask our funders to come along for that respectful process of working in the communities that we seek to partner with. And so I think the best funders understand that how we do the work matters as much, and in my view, more than what we ultimately achieve. And in our case at Hello World, it would be quicker, it would be easier, and it would be cheaper to prefabricate without hiring anyone in those countries whatsoever, get loads of photos without consent and get out again. And I, you know, as absurd as it sounds, I have been encouraged to do that by funders for a decade. But it's not just that it wouldn't work, it would be worse than useless. It's not respectful, and it perpetuates a neo-colonial attitude in the international development sector, which is incredibly undermining and unproductive, uncreative. So I do think that charities also have a responsibility to really advocate for how we do this work, both in the creation of teams and respectful consultation with, I think, what donors call beneficiaries, but we call communities.
Thank you. It feels to me also like there's something in there about the, if you like, the commodification of what organizations are doing, you know, just needing to generate that impact very fast. There's this constant compulsion to scale as well. Everybody's goal, I think, I'm sure you're nodding, John, conversations I've had with funders in the past, everybody is on a route to scale. Is that really right? Is it mirroring systems that, you know, perhaps economically are not viable? And how do we, one of the things I've enjoyed listening to you speak, Katrin, is about this emphasis of, you know, arguably doing less, but doing it better. And so are there ways that organizations can be supported by funders to do that. John, I think you opened a little bit with this, but I wonder what those funding mechanisms might look like that are supporting that kind of approach, that kind of mindset. And does it require a seismic shift in how funders operate? I guess is my question.
Would do a bit of self-add here, but saying that outcomes funding's idea is exactly that, you know, because I do believe we need scale, because the problems we're facing, you know, I think, you know, kind of, we used to say in the next 6,000 days, now there are only 5,000 days left, you know, kind of in Africa will have 1 billion people in the job market, you know, kind of, so, and the learning crisis, huge health crisis. I mean, like, I don't think that we will be successful kind of handling it 10 people at a time. So we definitely need scale. But the question is, how can you have scale while keeping that kind of local, customized, bespoke solution to that space, you know? And that's what we're trying to do through outcomes funding, because in a way, we are holding people accountable for an outcomes. Let's say for girls that move to primary and to secondary and stays there 4 years, I mean, with a certain degree, or for a young person who's went through skill training and is at least employed with a certain minimum wage. But then how you implement that on the ground in that specific district or school, you're kind of free to do. You know, maybe you need to work with teachers, or you need to work with parents, or you need to build toilets, or you need to, you know, kind of, that's the idea, not to hold you accountable for the activity, so that the people who are more on the ground and working in the communities and being part of the community can find the solution, as long as within ethical, obviously, standards, you can achieve the outcomes. I don't really care what you do, you know, because you should do what helps there, and maybe it's 360 different, 180 degree different to what you need to do in another region or another place, you know, and that's kind of what we are trying to do through this outcomes funding. But again, it's kind of also, you know, kind of taking power dynamics, also kind of changing them, you know, so not a lot of people say, okay, but what will they do with our funding? And I was like, your outcomes funding, they're achieving these results.
Doesn't matter. Yeah.
I'm not telling you now, like, and sometimes like, oh, to give you the outcome funding, I need to know more what they're going to do with the money. And it's like, it's a whole re-education process that we're doing.
Yes.
I would say that,
No, Moki, you go.
Yeah, I just wanted to just add on to the conversation of, you know, about scale, which I don't think we should be asking, you know, funders to not want to scale, because I think to Amel's point, that's how we're going to achieve the impact we want, but it's in how we scale. Because I think the traditional approach has been, in order to scale, we need big organizations who've got, you know, massive footprint across the continent to be able to help us scale. And I think what we are seeing, and Katrina, to your point, it's about working with smaller organizations, and where the role of intermediaries comes in. Because if you're a funder and you cannot do 100 grants at, you know, $100,000, you want to do one grant for 5 million, you can, but your intermediary needs to be the one doing that. African Filter is trying to be an intermediary. I mean, you know, we haven't got the, you know, the funding, you know, the amounts of, you know, Open Society and Ford, who are our funders. But what we are doing is we're realizing there's a huge demand for small amounts of money, which can, to work in communities, that can go a long way. So our smallest grant is $500 cash. And we've launched a fund called the Kickaway Fund, which does grants between $500 and $2,000. It's a lot of money in some communities, and can impact, you know, can lead to scale. And I think the other thing about governance, it's not so much we don't want governance, or, you know, we should just be giving money to organizations locally without the, you know, structures in place. But again, it's what type of structures, because what structures a Western or, you know, global North organization requires is not one maybe a local one has. So that you have to come up with more clever ways. And I'm not saying we are clever, but one of the things we are doing, because we're getting these tiny grants, is that, you know, we give grants to people in the arts and media sector. So if you want to come get a grant from us, we don't ask you for your, well, we can't ask you for, you know, proof of your financials for the last 5 years and all of that. We look at your social media account. We look at what you've been posting to say that, have you been in this sector like you say you have? Have you been realistically posting the kind of stuff that you're claiming you can do for us? So that's one. And it's just like a simple thing like, have you had a conversation with this person. And in Africa, for example, not everybody has a bank account, because having a bank account is actually quite a difficult thing to achieve. So we partnered with Western Union, for example, so we can actually give you cash. And in terms of the tranches, I've been in situations where, you say we're going to give the money 3 tranches. That's our sort of way of making, governance, making sure you don't go off and blow the money. And sometimes that's an issue because they actually need the money to implement the project. So now you put a roadblock in their way because of this gift you've given them. So what we try and do is, if it's small amounts, we have to trust that what they say they're going to do is what they're going to do. So we give them the money. So we're moving away from tranches, and it gives us more admin anyway, but it just empowers them. It shows trust that, hold on, you said you're going to do this. We're going to trust you to do that. So I think governance is important. Scale is important, but the type of government structures and the type of scale that we're looking at needs to kind of just not change, just be adapted to the conditions.
Moki, I really appreciate everything that you were talking about. From my point of view, scale really matters. Until every child has access to a world-class education, we are not doing our jobs. It does matter. And I want it quickly. But my argument about scale is how, as you say, and to your point, my view is that Hello World's best chance of scale is to open source our methodology, our engineering work, our community-based and community-led way of working, so that other people anywhere can pick it up and easily replicate it, so that you don't have to come to us to do what Hello World does. You can do it yourself. It's all openly available. But also recruiting in every single community that every single community that builds their own Hello Hub, because that's how it works. Hello World recruits, and in that way we have this growing team across countries who can take this work forwards. And it means that we don't need to send people in from any other country, that the skills are in the countries and the communities in which we work. And in that way, scale is most effective in my view. But also it means that we'll better iterate on the plan and amend it, change it, hold it up to the light and interrogate it and make it appropriate in the different communities that we work on as we move.
Thank you, Katrin. I'm going to turn it over. We had some great questions coming through in the Q&A panel. I just would like to also, John, there was something you talked about in the build up to this call about a focus on where the governance of the money sits. I don't know if that's something that you'd like to speak to in terms of, we've talked about governance among grantees, but actually from the funder side, is that part of this shifting piece?
Yeah, no, the last couple of years, we've had a lot of conversations within the philanthropy community, the international philanthropy community, about trying to avoid INGOs and go to local NGOs, and we talked a bit about that in this conversation. But if the money still is governed and run from the global north, then the center of power remains there. This is separate from all the issues of capacity and trust and everything else. So I think ultimately what happens is you might take out that particular middleman, but what happens is that you end up with the funder with a greater direct controlling relationship on the beneficiary NGO, the local NGO. And I'm not sure the process of moving away from and bypassing INGOs actually solves the underlying issue. The only way you can really solve the underlying issue is shifting decision-making about the money itself to local countries. And it's basically a wholesale grant from one philanthropic board that sits in wherever it is, Bermuda, for example, over to the country in which it's going to be distributed. I think one of the issues is that I'm sure everyone on this call is saying that's not, you may think that's just not going to happen, and it probably won't. But it is an underlying kind of tension here, that philanthropies generally want to do the right thing, right up to the point it involves giving away some of their power. And that's what I've found time and time again. And you know, you can say we're going to bypass NGOs because we believe in empowering local organizations, but you're not empowering local organizations. It's just you're bypassing the NGO, and that doesn't actually change the overall dynamic.
And the question is what type of intermediary you have, because I think we are probably one form of them that doesn't make sense to multiply too much, because the level of expertise that we're building is just like, it doesn't make sense. It would be too expensive for everyone to build expertise around results-based finance and how to do outcomes funding and the whole legal structure of it and everything. I mean, it would be insane. It wouldn't even make sense, you know? But looking back, I think if I think would have I done something differently? Yes and no. And the yes part is that, you know, what Moki talked about is that, for example, I had to hire people who speak English, you know, being in a non-Anglophone country, it meant like they were much more expensive, and, you know, and then, you know, I had to have people who are able to write the type of emails and proposals and all this communication that like a World Foundation or kind of an aid donor would see as professional, which is like so impossible and kind of so expensive, and also not even sure these are the best people to do the work in the communities, you know. So in a way, maybe the part, but I wanted to be inclusive. I wanted to have one team. I didn't want to have two layers. You know, I wanted the people who work on the project to be the people who talk with the funder. But today, I think looking back, I may have been more successful in introducing a certain layer of people who do the communication with those funders, you know, whose emails are, you know, the right grammar and the right autograph, and, you know, whose slides look nice and everything looks professional, and kind of then hiring more local leaders that I know do a lot of great work, but they're unable to write an email, you know, let alone a super sophisticated proposal for which sometimes I had to ask friends to pay for, because I'd hire someone from London or Berlin to write a proposal, which we wouldn't even be able to write. And so if someone asked me for a solution now, if they were like a small NGO or, you know, a local organization, I probably would tell them, if you can't change the whole system by yourself, you probably need some form of intermediary. So either partner with an NGO or partner with an INGO in the north, because otherwise you're going to drown.
Yeah. Can I? Sorry, no. Don't.
I promised to make some time for questions from our fabulous audience. I wonder whether I might just open up to some of those. And is that okay, Katrin?
Of course.
So on exactly as you were just talking about, Amel, that international NGO, local NGO interface, there's a couple of questions here. So firstly, let me invite, and if you'd like to put the question yourself, Ruth will unmute you and you can do so. Oladapo Owu, you asked a question on this. Would you like to put it to the panel?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi.
Hi, thanks, Dominic. It's Oladapo Owo, and hi, John. And hi, so I know John from somewhere else. This has been just amazing to hear you guys talk about the things you've talked about, and I couldn't agree more with what has been said. So my question is very much along the lines of relationship building. So, and from the perspective of if like young or relatively small organization. And it's how do we even begin to get a face time needed with the sort of funders that you are all describing? Because my concern is, even when this sea change happens and we are in the world where unrestricted funds are being given, that the same big players will be the ones accessing it just because they already hold the connections and relationships with these funders.
Couldn't hear you, Dominic, for some reason.
Oh, I was going to say, would someone like to take that question?
Well, I can answer it a little bit from the perspective of it is very difficult. Funders, you know, have their time constraints, and they don't want to waste people's time as well. But I think what the issue is, particularly with locally run organizations, in terms of talking about what we've been talking about, in the UK, when I started Peas, there were funders that were dedicated to smallish grants to back individual social entrepreneurs who had an idea and were developing it, to give them the cost to actually take a risk. And often in your early 20s or whatever, you don't need a huge amount. I got a grant of £20,000 that funded my entire living costs and helped me launch the organization Peas in its first year. And I don't think there are enough of those working to support and seed and fertilize the early stage organizations in that are led and governed domestically in Africa. And I think so there is a kind of, there's a niche there that isn't being very well served. And I'm saying that as a funder, you know, we've decided that we want to have fewer, deeper partnerships kicking in with turnovers about $400,000. So we're looking at a different kind of group, and we want to help accelerate them through to $20 million turnovers. Sometimes they don't grow that far because obviously scale can be in lots of different ways. But what I would say is, you know, I do think if there are funders out there that are able to fill that niche, that would be a great thing, because it is basically a big gap. Just in my experience as a sort of grantee, get to the conferences. The way I met Amel, first of all, was by going along to a presentation she was making about the Education Outcomes Fund 3 or 4 years ago. I got in touch with, you know, said, have you got 20 minutes to follow up after the presentation she gave? I ended up working for Amel on a contract 2 years later. And so there is a kind of, you know, keep working at it, keep getting in touch, talk about what you're doing, and be interested in what's their agenda as well, because ultimately when you're fundraising, you are trying to solve the person's agenda that you're talking to, because it's sales. Fundraising is sales as well.
Thank you, John. Maybe I can invite Laurie, if you're there, Laurie, to ask your question next. You should be unmuted by Ruth.
Okay, hi, good morning. Well, it's morning here. My question is, it was stated earlier about the funder having a very strict idea of percentage to go towards programming compared to administrative overhead costs, which is a huge thing here in the States. And I was asking if you had any suggestions on how to influence the mindset so that they might be a little bit more open to providing funding outside of programming.
Yeah, this feels like it's one for you, John.
I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry to dominate these answers, but so the big thing is, yeah, building that unrestricted pitch. Do you have a clear X amount of impact per dollar? If you have that, then that's the product that you're selling. You're selling, you know, one extra child in school for a year for a certain number of dollars. And if you've got that as across the whole organization as a whole, you can say every time you give $100 to the organization as a whole, you're effectively creating that. So I think that really helps. The other thing is, you know, wherever possible, we should all be sharing the data around the fact that organizations with higher core costs and admin costs actually are more efficient in terms of bang for buck up to a certain level than organizations with lower. And there is research that sort of proves that point. So it's a complete and utter fallacy to think that lower admin costs equals higher product. What it comes from, partly, apart from ignorance, it also comes from amongst philanthropists, this issue of thinking about my impact rather than total impact. And I think both on the philanthropy side and the grantee side, we need to always be pushing towards thinking about what's my impact on the system as a whole, and what's my impact, by that I mean system as a whole within the grant making organization, the grantee, but also the wider system. And you get ridiculous things like corporate foundations setting up a grant making process where 1,000 grantees will apply. And when you look at the total cost put into those applications, the benefit and the impact of the money going to one grantee is less than the total wasted time and effort put into the grant process, and you get net negative impact. Of course, you never report that back to your board, and so you get these ridiculous grant making processes that has net negative impact on the world as a whole. So their total impact's negative, even though their direct impact looks positive. That happens so often and needs to be sort of countered wherever possible.
Dominic, can I just contribute so that John doesn't think anyone addressing all the answers? And it's really just to give an example of one of my funders, which is the Ford Foundation, something they have done, because I think it's a very real systemic problem within foundations and the way they fund. It's programmatic, therefore there's this percentage. But what Ford has done is they've created this program called Build, which is almost an operational support grant for a handful, or not all of their grantees, but a bunch of their grantees that they feel are important and strategic. And that money is really for operational support. It's to get you doing what you need to do to survive. And then the other program officers that continue to do their programmatic funding, which is restricted to whatever. So that's what one organization has done to address that. So it's not a complete change in the way they work, but it's changing the structure internally to accommodate what the needs are on the ground.
And I've had, very few enlightened funders, and, some who pay us to write the proposal, like who cover the cost of the proposal writing, or, kind of that's one example, and so, because they're very aware of this whole thing. But I guess, this problem exists also like in the US, which is one of the very thriving philanthropic places and charity. But I think it's for me, I may be a bit optimistic here, because I think the whole world is changing, because the role of nonprofits and philanthropy is moving away from charity to be kind of core of solving global challenges, and kind of an equal power, hopefully in future, as governments or private sector, etc. And so we will ask ourselves one day the question, why do you get more money to kind of work in oil and gas than to work in a charity that supports with climate change? Like, why do we sit in a separate room from heads of states? And the more I'm thinking climate change happened a bit, but the more kind of NGO and nonprofit leaders have a seat at the table, rather than being the activists from outside who are criticizing, kind of having in the same seat at the same table than the private sector, the big corporates, the heads of government, the more I hope we will kind of get to a space where we think these are real organizations with real needs, and kind of we have to build them. So I hope the arc of history is kind of moving anywhere towards a better place here. But for people working today, they're kind of still stuck.
I do think it's a huge benefit of the Education Outcomes Fund and outcomes funding generally, because obviously you get more flexible finance, but the biggest thing that happens with the development impact bonds that Amel's creating is you get real coherence and a shared agenda at the beginning of the process. You've got local country government, you've got big aid, you've got the development partners and local communities, and the third party evaluation all coming together at the start, agreeing this is what our collective vision is of impact over time. And a lot of even unrestricted funding between a grantor and a beneficiary doesn't solve then for potential lack of coherence within a system. And I think EOF is something to be celebrated, that you're playing a big role within that. And by doing that, you're taking those service providers or the local country NGOs and bringing them into conversation with the Ministry of Education to make sure that their voices are heard.
Thank you. I'd like to, if I can, invite a question from Martine about donors being risk averse. And Martine, I reference that one because you've asked a couple of questions. If we unmute you, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. I was really interested in the different insight, but you know, what comes through is also the question of, you know, what is development and how donors, you know, kind of tailor their approach, you know, to grants towards, you know, a fully developmental approach. And what I see, I feel, you know, is that little by little donors have become so attached to very, very specific, you know, kind of outcomes that they have become totally risk adverse when the business in which we work is extremely complex and you know, and has a combination of progress and risks and failures that are inherently, you know, kind of linked if we are, you know, if we want a mature development to proceed. And I keep wondering to which extent, you know, all the very rich examples that a lot of, you know, foundations and groups of donors who have been thinking through what works, you know, could really reach out, you know, country donors and very large scale institutions to, you know, to change a little bit the paradigms. And I mean, the same for our NGOs, but there is certainly a need to define new rules and what would be really empowering rules. I mean, I don't know what you think about that.
Follows on a little bit from what you were talking about, I think just now, Amel, about new rules. Katrin, were you going to come in on this point?
Well, a little bit, yes. I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. We're trying to solve some of the world's most intractable problems, and the solution is not simple. It's multifaceted, and we need to legislate for the complexity of the problems that we are facing. I think there is a lot of jargon in our sector, and there are increasing numbers of funding trends that encourage mission creep from charities. So, you know, it becomes fashionable with funders to fund in one way or another way. And I think that perhaps if we could take it back to basics, for me at least, the best donors understand that the most important thing we can do is listen to the communities that we work with. And at the moment, everyone's talking about impact and how we measure the impact and the outcome of our work. And for me, an outcome measurement process is a listening exercise, is just listening. Has this project worked? Has it been of value? Was it not successful? Was it somewhere in between? If so, why? And I think that we're not doing enough of that. And if we could do more of that, then we'll join the dots better between all of the players. And I think it goes back again to the point that John so eloquently made about people not wanting to give up their power. And I think one of the power dynamics that I see at play in our sector is people in offices in LA or New York or London determining what they think a good outcome is, and then imposing that on an implementing partner. I guess my question to them would be, who are you to say what a good outcome is? You're not the person for whom this grant is being given. Let's ask them and see what they think. Was this successful? Did you like it? How would you do it differently? And I think if we go back to basics like that, we can simplify our sector in a way that we urgently need to, because it is a minefield. It is really hard to figure out how to navigate the different players out there. And it shouldn't require being an expert in the diplomacy of international development to just be able to do good work.
I mean, there is a risk what just been said in the question is of this kind of very sharp focus, you know, also on outcomes, because and of the risk of you know, like offending, you know, kind of many funders here, but kind of being a funder ourselves. So we sit kind of often in kind of used to dinners before COVID or conversations, you know, other CEOs of foundations sit, etc. And I would provocatively say that probably 80, like if I say 100% of philanthropic money, you know, I would say 80% of it doesn't care about outcomes, you know. It's more about, you know, and this every CEO tells me, if they're not like the principal, they say, look, it's about having great stories that my kind of, you know, principal can tell at dinner tables, you know. It's the reality, you know, I need those stories, I need those emotional stories, I need those things. No, it's not about the final outcome. And then you have, let's say, optimistic 20% who really care about outcome and impact. And once you kind of bring to them the thing, okay, you are not going to be held accountable for activities, your grantees, you hold them accountable for outcomes, and you tell them how much effort they have to do into listening, but also using great methodologies to measure that outcomes, then they feel that the price is really high, you know, and they feel sometimes it takes longer because, okay, they could give a grant tomorrow, but like getting the government and the local community and everyone to agree, you know, and kind of, I feel almost like those conversations that happen later when you have a crisis, like making them earlier, then you kind of, okay, then you lose another 15%, then you're left with 5%, you know, who's still there. But those are so advanced that they start then thinking of, okay, if I spend $1 on a malaria net, like they say, like, oh, how am I going to save lives? You know, like if, you know, if then they start comparing education with a malaria net or a vaccine, you know, and then you always lose, you know, the arts, education, other, you know, human rights always lose against, you know, these things, because then it becomes very narrow and they're like, passionate, yes, I spent all this money to measure outcomes. Yes, I want impact. And now I'm gonna, you know, make a very kind of blockchain train thing to tell me, you know, kind of where the impact, and then you kind of, so for me, that's kind of the spectrum at the moment, you know, and so navigating that spectrum is interesting, and how we can increase that tranche of not the super scientific one that compare education, for example, to malaria net that we will always lose, you know, mosquito nets, but kind of, can we expand that spectrum of those who do care about outcomes and impacts to be more open to do things differently? And I think, you know, people like John and Katrin and Moki here are doing that work, because you're kind of talking with those funders and changing the narrative and, you know, kind of changing the way we do things. And that's the important bit, I guess.
Thank you, Amel. We have a few minutes left. I'd like to invite one final question, which I think will bring us full circle, because it's around that original piece we spoke to of trust. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Ayatollah, are you there? And if so, you can be unmuted and ask your question yourself.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Honestly, there's so much that this has triggered in my mind, and I'm hoping I'll try and be as brief as possible. I was asking if Moki could speak to how trust works in these relationships. Now, I work for a not-for-profit that is a fund, and it's almost like it. You know, the way we work is we pull in funds and then we fund other local partners. And so, for instance, practically from my perspective, I've had instances where I raise funds and then the local grantees want to have some sort of scope creep where they want to do things other than what my organization is focused on. And Moki had spoken to this earlier, she had alluded to this when she was talking about trust. And so I just wanted to kind of understand how it works, because in my mind, trust has to be earned. So you have to, first of all, show me that I can trust you with these funds, and then I can sustain that trust. But it appeared, correct me if I'm wrong, Moki, it appeared, you know, that what you were saying is, well, you have to trust them first. And because we understand how scarce resources are vis-a-vis all the many problems, we need to be sure that the funds that we're getting are applied judiciously. So how do you balance, how do you net off, how do you invest trust vis-a-vis the outcomes that you're expecting? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I mean, I think it's a little bit chicken and egg, because you don't necessarily have the track record in exactly what that funder needs you to have. So in order for them to extend those grants to you, they may think, well, this organization's never done it before, which is where the trust comes in first. They have to trust that you can do it. But the way to show that you have experience of impact is to show the work you've been doing. You've got to have had a track record of delivery of some sort. So that I'm not talking about blind trust, blind faith, that, you just walking off the street and we give you the money. But what I'm saying is that, there's certain things I think funders would like to see. And one thing from being on the funder side, instead of in this hybrid position I'm in now, is that you want amazing grantees. You want your grantees to be successful, because the more successful they are, to be honest, the better you look, right? So I want to see the people that I'm giving money to doing well. So you want to choose carefully. But I think a lot of funders have forgotten what their role is, particularly philanthropists, that their role is to take risk, because we are putting in money, or funders in the philanthropy sector putting in money where governments can't because they don't have it, and where the private sector won't because they're accountable to the board and there's no profit motive. So there is this gap. And I think sometimes philanthropists forget that their role is to take the risk, that that government won't and private sector can't. And to that, you have to take a certain amount of risk with the people you give that money to. It's all incorporated in that same risk. And, so for me, when I think about how do you build trust, I have never run a donor collaborative doing what I'm doing right now, but my funders trusted me. They gave me that trust ahead of time. And I think a lot of it was to do with, apart from, the interview or whatever, but there was a clear strategy. I wasn't asking them to buy into just me. They were buying into a process that I had developed about how are we going to achieve your mission. And I think that was important. There was a strategy they could understand, they could buy into, that was, okay, beyond me. It had nothing to do with me. I mean, I wrote it, but I had to have outcomes. I had to have all the things they look for. And that's what I'm saying, that they had to have given me that trust first, because if they hadn't, I'd never have written the strategy and we'd never have the donor collaborative. So it is a bit chicken and egg, but yeah, I think trust has to come first to a certain extent.
Moki, you have beautifully brought us back to one of the opening sentiments of give trust and take risk. Thank you. On that note, I'm really conscious of time. An hour and a half has gone so quickly. The conversation has been fantastic. I'd like to apologize to everybody who asked a question that we didn't get to. We tried to answer as many of the questions as we could. There will be a recording available, and certainly we will be working hard to compile some of the recommendations, lessons, learnings from this and share them more widely across the sector. I would just like to, in the interest of closing when I said we would, I'd like to thank all of our fabulous panelists. You've been absolutely brilliant, and it's been a delight to share this time with you. You've engaged so much. You've been so generous with your time and your thoughts and your experience. What a great way to start our week of knowledge festivals. So thank you very much. I'm incredibly grateful, and thank you to everybody who tuned in and stuck with us for the full 90 minutes. We will close the session now, and do look out for more messages and follow-up communications on our LinkedIn platform primarily. Thank you, everyone.